That was us.
Everyone, welcome and thank you, and apologies for the delay to this cursed seminar. This is the second attempt we've had to run it. The first one, the YouTube link failed and nobody joined. And on this particular iteration, South West Rails decided to delay our train by an hour as we were on it. But we've made it here. Thank you for coming as well. What we're going to talk about is the paper that I've written, War in the 21st Century. So my name is Andrew Fox. I'm one of the research fellows at the Henry Jackson Society. Prior to coming here, I was a senior lecturer at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. And prior to that, I served in the British Army in the parachute regiments from 2005 to 21, with Afghanistan being my particular war. Incredibly grateful for our two guests. Dr. Stuart Mitchell, I'll start with you. Stu is currently a senior lecturer at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. Primarily, initially a First World War historian, but now he has vastly expanded his portfolio to be an expert on essentially everything. Stuart was a colleague of mine. I hesitate to say that he was a peer because he is a master of his trade. And then, of course, James Cartledge is the Shadow Secretary of State for Defence. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. He's had a long commute here. His lateness is none of his doing. It was entirely the delay on our part, I should add. So.
Absolutely late, just to be clear.
But also a former procurement minister in another life. So very relevant experience and knowledge about some of the topics we're going to talk about today. So the paper itself, I really have a bugbear from my time as an academic where there's a terrible habit in the military particularly where, because they very often think in quite binary ways, mapping conflict A exactly onto conflict B is kind of leads people down some fairly false conclusion pathways. The first example I would give is the recently finished, praise be, Gaza war, hopefully, fingers crossed, touch wood, where a lot of commentators were saying, oh, it's just like Northern Ireland, you just have to talk to Hamas and you can, get their disarmament effected in that manner. Clearly not applicable to a psychotic jihadi terror group. As bad as Sinn Féin were, and as evil as their deeds were, they had a very different mindset to the way Hamas operated. And so mapping Northern Ireland onto Gaza was a false conclusion to draw. Another really common one, when I served in Afghanistan, there was a book called How to Eat Soup with a Knife, wasn't it? Yeah.
Learning to Eat Soup.
Learning to Eat Soup with a Knife by John Nagel, which said that Malaya worked really well by doing these things. Let's just do these things in Afghanistan and everything will go well. And it turns out that 1950s counterinsurgency doesn't work particularly well when you try and do it in what is effectively a minefield. So some really false lessons have been learned. And so what I tried to do with this is draw out lessons which I think are general, which are taken from Gaza and from Ukraine. One is the sort of preeminent conventional war of our time, and one is the preeminent asymmetric war of our time, by which I mean it wasn't two fixed armies on a battlefield. I mean, it was initially, but then, of course, Hamas reverted to the tunnels. They reverted to various other sort of traditionally guerrilla methods of fighting, rather than having pitched battles with the IDF in the sense that Ukraine and Russia are at the moment. And so from looking at these two wars, which I have had the fortune and luck to have visited the front lines of both, I'm trying to draw sort of principles which might guide our thinking in future conflicts. Rather than give a prescription of how we should fight them, I'd like to give a menu of how we might like to consider fighting them should we end up taking those conflicts on. And really, I've drawn 7 principles out. So we're looking at how we operate in an era where NATO is looking shakier than ever due to sort of the lack of guaranteed American support today, perhaps in the way it was in years gone by. Thinking about how we do procurements, because we're tending still towards very large, expensive, big ticket items that take many, many years to come into effect. And we can look at different ways of doing procurement so we can get the technology of today to the battlefield faster without spending a fortune. And and more importantly, we can do it at mass. The drone revolution doesn't really need hammering home. This is something that's kind of at the forefront of almost all contemporary military thinking, especially if we see how in the last 12 months, drones have absolutely revolutionized the battlefield in Ukraine. Accelerating innovation. So we're looking at an era where technology is improving and developing at an exponential rate. So what was in date and up to date and cutting edge and modern today almost certainly won't be tomorrow and definitely won't be next week. How do we adapt our procurement cycles to adapt to that rapid expansion of technology? Looking at legal and ethical challenges, and the IDF are a great example of the challenges of applying traditional law of armed conflict in a battle space like the one presented in Gaza. Incredibly challenging to do, especially when your enemy is trying to sacrifice their own civilians to maximize PR gains. Tied into ethics is how do we use artificial intelligence? We're seeing this huge explosion. If you've followed the evolution of ChatGPT just over the last year, you can see the pace at which this is improving. And that presents us with a minefield because our enemies don't care if they start cutting humans out of the kill chain. They're quite happy for robots to do their killing. We don't operate that way. That doesn't tally with the law of armed conflict. And so how do we maintain an edge against an enemy that's using AI freely when we have these ethical, moral, and legal constraints on how we do it? And then finally, the information battlefield. And both Ukraine and Israel found setbacks on the battlefield directly through enemy propaganda. And we're living in an era now where 24/7 saturated media coverage, where you can have an airstrike footage on your mobile phone within seconds of it actually happening on the ground, is affecting the way that wars are perceived. And we'll talk about Clausewitz and how the home front might be affected. And on Clausewitz, it's the perfect time to hand over to the war studies lecturer at Sandhurst.
Thank you for that far too generous introduction, Andrew. And thank you all for coming along today, particularly after the struggles that we had initially arranging this and the patience with us for being late. I feel partly responsible, like I have some curse hanging over me for this. Now, as Andrew's mentioned there, I am going to indulge myself by starting my little preamble with a little bit of military philosophy. So just bear with me. The quote is not that long, but I do think it's very apposite for what we're doing today. It's my favourite little Clausewitz quote, and not one that's often quoted. And he wrote way back in 1832, "When political objects are unimportant, motives slight, and tensions of the forces small, a cautious commander may skillfully try all sorts of ways by which, without great crisis and bloody solutions, he may twist himself into a peace through the characteristic weaknesses of his opponent in the field and in the cabinet. We have no right to blame him if the assumptions on which he acts are well founded and promise success. But still, we must require him to remember that it is a slippery path he is treading on which the god of war may surprise him, and to keep his eye always upon the enemy, that he may not have to defend himself with the dressed rapier if that enemy takes up a sharp sword." Now, I love that quote because it tells us a lot about the difficulties that both politicians and practitioners face when judging the future and current of military operations. It challenges us to think about the implications of faulty assumptions, about assuming that the war today is going to be the same as the war tomorrow. And I think that when we're looking at the present, we do, of course, have to consider the historical past. I think that's probably why you've got me in to talk a little bit about that today. But the way we also manage it is through breadth of understanding and depth of understanding. And I think what this paper really generates is both. It looks at those current trends that Andrew has very well summarised there, but it also challenges us to think about the spectrum of conflict and its historical precedents and how they feed into some of the narratives today. And that's where I really think this paper shines. It provides us with a starting point to think about elements like politics, procurement, law, ethics, as well as the usual technological fascination. And it is very easy to be drawn into the technological elements and look at how quickly things are changing. But I also think we must remember that technological change has been a constant, There has always been another thing coming along. So the key is not to get fascinated just by the technological changes, but how they get implemented into the human systems. And I think by discussing these issues in a very broad sense, what this paper does is generate that discussion and open the door for further discussion for practitioners and politicians alike. Of course, I think the technological element, the bases are covered as well. So we've got drones, we've got AI, but I also think it begs some questions for, broadly speaking, Western forces about how we might confront the challenges that opponents who might have been assumed to be at a technological disadvantage are now potentially going to, if not be on a par, be very, very close in capabilities because of that democratization of technology. So how do we face down those adversaries? I also quite like the elements on information and innovation cycles, and I think they go a long way to telling us some of those solutions to the problems that we might face. But it is also going to beg some hard truths that we might have to confront along the way. And how do we deal with uncertain legal affairs? How do we deal with uncertain political futures and potentially rising cost of some of these things in both modern Britain and beyond? And all of these are questions that I'm absolutely going to defer because it's not my place to be having those conversations. But more broadly, and this goes back to the reason why I started with Clausewitz, Clausewitz begs of us to think not just about war in terms of its character, which changes, but about its nature, which endures. And I'd like to think that by thinking about these facets of current conflict, we are not just thinking about a narrow range of perspectives, but we're thinking more broadly about the things that matter in the long term. Now, I've got plenty of points about the other facets of this, but I'll keep those for our discussion, and I'll hand over to the honourable gentleman to my right. James.
Thank you. Well, and as I say, just to be clear, I as a sort of uncrewed politician, I autonomously followed the directions I was given to arrive at the time I did because of the chronological situation in which we found ourselves. But you know, I'm fascinated by this. I think it's a brilliant paper. It's exactly where I was intensely focused when I was a procurement minister, and remain so as Shadow Secretary of State. I hope that it's kind of a quirk of fate almost that we had a very bad election result, but it did kind of mean inevitably as the one of two remaining former defence ministers who still wanted to be shadow minister that I was going to be heavily involved and have a chance to hold the government to account to what extent they were going to do the things I was trying to do. So I became procurement minister in April 2023. It mentions Ajax. The day I got the job, you remember Dominic Raab resigned. He was replaced by Alex Chalk as Lord Chancellor, so I replaced Alex Chalk. And walking around the House of Commons voting, we were in the middle of a vote. Everyone said, "Congratulations, you've got Ajax." You know, and it was like the thing of procurement at the time. So I always refer to my time as the parallel universe, which is something Tony Radican spoke about recently. I became intensely aware of the amazing things we were doing for Ukraine and the speed and the risk. And at the same time, in parallel, the business as usual for the British Armed Forces, slow, expensive, ponderous procurement. And I was determined to change that so that we grew in parallel in terms of the UK military. Very early on, I had a roundtable of these UK drone SMEs, some of which are now part of bigger companies or have been very successful in their own right. Realizing the critical importance of this technology and something I can say now as a shadow, intensely aware of the bureaucratic nature of the MOD and the very slow the difficulty it has prioritizing, the sense in which, you know, you go to a meeting of all the top brass and everyone would agree you need to make some difficult decisions. Well, that's a brilliant thing to agree on. The next step is actually to make some difficult decisions. And it is difficult. You know, real government in an operational department is very challenging. But I had my sort of moment of realization, which couldn't talk about at the time publicly, and this has gradually become public, was in October 23. I went to visit a UK SME that was making a very impressive drone for one-way attack in Ukraine, which would be used within a few months very successfully. And, I came away from that. It was cheap relatively, tens of thousands of pounds against the millions of pounds you have to spend. Built very quickly. It had an impact in a war against the strongest military in Europe. And I thought, well, this is something. But the crucial thing was the way after it happened, they got feedback immediately, and then they changed it. Spiral development. This myth was real. And it really inspired me. And in February 24, I came out with a drone strategy and a new procurement model called the integrated procurement model. And I tried to implement them, but then Rishi did something rather silly. He called a general election. But a few examples where we genuinely tried to practically implement them. And if the government were to do so, a lot of the things you're talking about in this very good paper would be much more real in the system. And there's really a key fault line which causes all the problems, which is about risk. But in essence, so the drone strategy actually is a really good example of it. I announced it in February 24 at Malloy in Maidenhead. Malloy, I was standing next to Jim Hockenhall on one hand and a Malloy T-150 quadcopter. Now that quadcopter was sold to the US Marine Corps. It was used after being used successfully in Ukraine for resupply and other things. And recently, you will have seen 2 weeks ago, it was cleared for use on the aircraft carrier, so carrying logistics between the carrier strike. Now, that's how the drone strategy was meant to work. We were meant to do stuff in Ukraine or elsewhere, but primarily in Ukraine, where we were supplying lots of stuff, learn from it, and then in parallel, bring that technology into the British Armed Forces. And that has not happened at anything like the scale it should have done. And the reason is staggeringly simple. So I was a Treasury Minister before I was Defence Minister. And all that's happened is the Treasury had agreed with the incoming government the money for Ukraine, but they hadn't agreed anything else. There's no procurement essentially happening in the UK at the moment other than Kindred. Kindred is the procurement for Ukraine. Very little in-year savings are the priority and you could call it penny pinching, and you could say, well, I would say that politically, but genuinely I am astonished at the degree to which that is being prioritized, because the thing that would most transform our armed forces, the thing that would have the quickest impact and is cheapest, which is investment in uncrewed systems for training at scale, particularly the army. Now, there's some experimentation happening. There are some things happening, but we could be a leading country in uncrewed. This is the thing I've been banging on about. It's very frustrating to watch. I'd love to be in there trying to make it happen. I'll just give you one example, because you took the paper's very good. It talks a lot about counter drone. There's a tendency to think always of taking things out, whereas, as you know, militarily, being able to resist and defend is as important, if not more important. And so something I tried to accelerate was directed energy weapons. And we had direct energy weapons. We had the Dragonfire laser, which was a very prominent example. And the reason is because we had a maritime threat. The Houthis had ballistic missiles from Iran. You need something that can take out the drones cheaply so that you don't denude your missiles, right? This was the essence of it. There are other technologies that can do this. But that's why I tried to use the principles of my procurement reform for that laser, and we stripped out lots of testing, lots of bureaucracy, etc. And so to finish, what it really is about is it's about risk. You've got to weigh more greatly military risk than what I call civil risk. So these are the risk of health and safety, being sued, judicial review, the normal things as a minister you have to be worried about. Whereas what should worry us is military risk. I think that there is not enough of a grasp in the heart of government of the serious threat to the United Kingdom, as has been posed by recent grey zone activity. And I find it astonishing that there has not been a much more rapid spending increase. It doesn't have to be at that vast a scale enough to open up drone procurement, because it's not the drones you buy and it's not the tech, it's the relationship you create between the user and the SMEs to exchange data constantly. That's how you get success. And so not starting that is really depriving us, and to a degree that is, I think, very depressing in many ways, because we have a brilliant armed forces and they could still be world leading, and they will be. But at the moment, we are delaying things very unnecessarily. But it's all about the key is risk, really. And so this is really good. Happy to talk about ethics and stuff as well in a bit if you want to. But also very important.
We see if we can get onto that. I think what I'll do now is I'll give you a couple of concrete examples of things I've seen from having visited various war zones. And a question for Stu that I think perhaps ties into what we were just talking about. So having seen Ukraine up close, I've developed something of a skill as the foreign army whisperer. I'm quite good at getting them to take me further forward than they take most people. And in Ukraine, I got as far forward as a battalion headquarters in contact. So we had their screens in front of us, and they had 5 TV screens, which represented a drone footage, kind of a drone feed of 150 different drones in the air at one time. An information inflow that frankly we could have just dreamed about in Afghanistan. You'd get maybe one drone if you were lucky. And I remember doing one patrol in Afghanistan when we had something called Green Eyes above us. I asked the drone operator to show me the feed that he had, and what we were getting was desert, 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 sky, 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 desert, 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 because the thing had malfunctioned. That's utterly useless. You know, but this is well over a decade ago, and things have clearly developed beyond all recognition since then. But if we look at how the war in Ukraine has evolved, in just a short space of time, they've gone from fighting anti-tank battles using Javelin missiles through to trench warfare. And I remember being at Sandhurst at the time, and there was actual discussion as to whether they should excavate some of the trenches that still sit on the training area from 1915-16. And that has now moved to a totally drone-saturated environment where strong points are the way forward. Trenches are now a thing of the past. If you move during daylight, you die immediately. And the majority of casualties are actually not coming on the fighting positions. They're coming in the last mile as troops infill and exfil from the fighting positions. And as a result, they've now got these huge nets that provide corridors for troops to sort of extract and infiltrate along. So we've seen a total evolution in just one war in 3 years, and it gives you an idea of the pace of how this stuff is happening. And I think what we're seeing is the needs of a nation at war. And I think that probably ties to what you've just been saying, James, that actually we can't justify that at the moment because the Treasury has other priorities. Whereas when you are fighting a war for national survival, then guess what? Everything changes on the spot. I visited the Forward factories they have in the Ukraine. I say a factory, it's simply, the one I visited was simply a classroom in a school. About 15 miles from the front line. So just outside FPV drone range, but still within very comfortable range of frontline artillery should they identify what they need to target. And it was simply a classroom about the size of this room. There were 3 Ukrainian chaps in there making 200 drones a month for between $200 and $650 per drone. And we went out with the bigger drone, the $650 drone, the Baba Yaga, which is a 6 propeller bladed evil thing that, you know, I've rarely seen something so evil in the sky. And they gave us a demonstration of dropping grenades from that. And that is a $650 killer made by Ukrainians in a cottage workshop mere miles from the front. You know, that is an unprecedented development that comes from the pressure of having been at war. Which leads me to my question to Stu, and it's a Second World War question. You're delighted to know.
Brilliant.
At what point between 39 and 45 do you think that we actually got on top of the development we needed? Because obviously, catastrophe at Dunkirk, retreat to the UK, Battle of Britain. When did we actually get on top of this?
There's not an easy answer to that question, of course, because it's history, and that would put me out of a job. There is the best way I could say is that it depends on the platform that you're looking at. Clearly, in some areas, Britain was more ahead of the curve than others. Airframes, Spitfire jumps to mind, but the Hurricane and other platforms in radar, there was a slight lead that you can point to for what it needs to do. And that's the other part of this question that makes it a difficult one to answer. That it's not just about creating airframes or capital ships or tanks or good guns or any of that material of war. It's about how do you build that into a system, and how do you train people so that they can get the best out of the kit that they have available. It doesn't necessarily need to be the best kit. It just needs to be in the right place at the right time, in the right hands. And generating that in the Second World War varied according to the platforms. It was also not a process of you get it right and that's that done, because of course your opponent is innovating at the same time. So you go through both, multiple different marks of Spitfire, and there's long question marks over what armament it should be given, and how do you enhance air performance, and likewise in terms of naval developments, and what should the future of a carrier look like is an enormous question. Depends where it's going to operate, depends who it's going to operate against. Armour, another great example. Britain goes through a lot of teething problems, both conceptually about what should armour be doing from the early portion of the war. And perhaps a great example of this is actually the French army, who create technologically really pretty good tanks, better armour, better armament, and but they're outfought because the system that they're trying to build it in, La Bataille Conduite, the sort of conducted battle, was conceptually more rooted in the First World War than the Second World War. So inferior on paper to tech specs, I suppose, tanks were able to outperform better ones if you were looking at it in kind of a top trumps way. So that becomes a very difficult question. Now, in terms of the more industrial side of that question, how does it produce? How did Britain produce its kit and equipment? I'm no expert on this, I should say. I mean, thank you for the billing that I am an expert in everything, but I'm unfortunately not. And when it comes to industrial strategy, all I could say is that it learnt a lot. The state learnt a lot from the trials and tribulations of the First World War. So it does in many ways avoid some of the mistakes that were made in the First World War by letting too many skilled personnel move into the forces and trying to make sure that you've got protected industries, that you don't take away the skills that you need to create and step up the level of production. But it's still, like everywhere, there are still bottlenecks, there are still limitations. The Treasury always still acts as a problem, even in wartime, when you think the taps would be turned on to the fullest. There are always processes that need to be gone through, and there are also dead ends that may seem like they're going to be the future, but don't necessarily prove to be as revolutionary as we might think. So all of that makes for a very, very complicated picture, I'm afraid, and a little bit of a fudge of an answer, but
no easy answers.
No easy answers, exactly.
This really leads me on. Do you think the blockage here is the fact that A, we're not at war, B, the imminent threat of war isn't sufficiently felt at the political level, and C, the Treasury are therefore not responding accordingly?
Well, I mean, there is a bit of a failure of leadership, which is, this is not unique to current government led by. So Starmer was particularly strong on defence spending before he had his summit with President Trump. But what happens in the interim? What's the reality in the interim? Well, there's very little money really in the next couple of years. It's all set a few years away, but the threat is now, arguably. I think one thing psychologically we have to get our head around, which I don't see enough from the government. John Healey is a really good Secretary of State. I don't think he's a Ben Wallace who's going to go and bash down the door of the Treasury and demand his share, to be fair. I think it's an opportunity. And I think that the way to look at this is the British Armed Forces could be transformed in a way that it will transform their lethality and survivability in a way that hasn't happened for generations, and where we can lead, not uniquely lead, because now other countries are getting on, but because of our science-based DSTL, etc., the way we, our experience, I really do think we could. And actually, I think if you take, for example, maritime, in the Second World War, we still had, we could, as a country, industrially mass produce large, vessels, vehicles, etc., in a way that it would not be possible now. It just wouldn't be possible. But would it even be militarily justifiable? Whereas, I've long felt that the advent of maritime drones will be very good news for an island like ours, where the Ukrainians in May famously took out a Russian fighter jet with one of their little bobbing drones. And that is, to me, that's incredible military moment. If you're an island, just think about the implications of that. uncrewed systems patrolling your island that give you air defense, but which are flexible and you can deploy them to the Red Sea or wherever, hopefully maybe a variation on them, if you need it. And I find that a very positive prospect. We just need to seize it. And I know the Navy are trying to, but one flaw we have is, as you said earlier, and it says in here quite rightly, is platform-centric procurement. And the services are dominated by the big platform. So, you know, if I would say to the First Sea Lord, I said to him a few weeks before I left the job, I said, what's your top priority? He inevitably would say a big ship. Well, that's 10 years away, that ship that's coming, the whatever Type 83, MRSS or whatever. In the Army, it'll be a big platform, and the same in the RAF, it's GCAP. Well, GCAP is 2040, if you're lucky. And this stuff is absorbing a lot of cash, whereas what you need now is something very different. You need, as it also says in here, you need mass from cheaper produced effectors. It doesn't mean everything is cheap. To have an effective, for example, you know, maritime uncrewed system that could defend Britain, or linking up those sensors, you'll presumably need a pretty expensive command and control system of some sort. You still need some very exquisite effectors to protect ships, to protect cities as a sort of, I think basically you've still got to spend a lot, and we still need a nuclear deterrent, which is where a huge amount of our money goes. And so you've still got to, you know, this doesn't mean this is cheap, but there is no question, as it rightly says in your paper, you could transform the UK's fighting capability quickly with mass production. The key is you've got to have a leadership that is prepared to embrace that. And on the Second World War example, I like in Anthony Beevor's D-Day book, he talks about Wittmann, he's like a Panzer ace. He just gets in his tank on it and just goes and destroys loads of British tanks and sort of.
It's a whole bloody division.
Yeah, and you know,
Not one thing. It was a whole battalion.
and anyway, he has a bit of a field day. He does eventually get taken out. He has a field day, and the thing is, apparently,
They died.
yeah, from a British agent. No, and well, this is debated. This is debated actually, but apparently he goes back. Sorry, the officers the senior officers get together. What is the lesson? The Americans go back and they say we need the Firefly essentially, which is the big cannon, and the Brits go. And Montgomery apparently sort of looks away as if it hasn't happened. You know, pretends this technological change isn't there, and that's what we could do. I mean, you know, I have some experience working on my drone strategy. I would say not everyone necessarily in the MOD was as keen to sort of get on with it as might have been. You know, there is a lot of being wedded to the current planning and thinking and platform. But we've got to break out. War is brutal. I've not experienced it. I've not been in the armed forces, but it's clearly brutal. And clearly you've got to move with, you've got to be competitive. That's the key. As well as having it all integrated and all the rest of it. And I think the UK could be very good at that. We've got to work out you know, what our priority should be. But to me, it's an opportunity. I really do think it's an extraordinary opportunity for the country to make us stronger in a way that we haven't had potentially available for generations.
Well, I think in many ways it's a mindset change.
Yeah, correct.
And, you know, I hark back to Afghanistan, but, you know, we were defeated by, you know, with our high-tech body armor and all the various bits of kit that we got to carry. We were defeated by guys in flip-flops with AK-47s who used IEDs made out of wood. You know, they certainly didn't have anywhere near the budget we had. But that speaks, I think, potentially more to strategy than anything else. But if you also look at Afghanistan, the idea that we were firing 75,000-pound Javelin missiles, you know, as a missile fired by a man who didn't earn that in a year against a man who didn't earn that in his lifetime. You know, there was something inverted there. And just recently, the European defense minister made the very good point that we should not be shooting down cheap Russian drones using very, very expensive air-to-air missiles or ground-based air defense systems. So there's, you know, the last thing I think we need at the moment in the UK Armed Forces is the Ukrainian ability to lock down several square kilometers of frontage, because we don't need that right now. There's not a scenario we're deploying into where we need that. What we need is to take those principles and apply them to what we need now.
No, exactly. And as I say, I mean, I'm not particularly pro one of the services or the other. I appreciate there's three separate services. But inevitably, from our homeland defence point of view, it is primarily maritime and air. Where I think the Army has an amazing opportunity is you know, in innovation. I still am surprised at how uncrewed ground vehicles are sort of lagging behind a bit. But I think I was talking to some Germans recently about this. Like, some of the thinking is they will also be transformative in their own way. It depends what your perception of what that means. But they could, even just a logistical basis, the extraordinary impact they could have. But yeah, I think it's about risk in several ways. From a financial point of view, it's crazy that we haven't just said to the MOD, look, Kindred is 3 billion a year for Ukraine. Here's, I don't know, 50% of that, and basically within reason, coordinated, not siloed through the single services, but coordinated so that there is, through Stratcom, some degree of integration, a sort of experimentation that has real backbone to it. Because when I became minister, Ben Wallace had put a moratorium on drones because he was so frustrated about how it was all, because of the system that has pertained until recently, bottom down procurement, led from the single services, not coordinated, lots of duplication. So we put a stop to that, and we wanted to have it more integrated, hence integrated procurement model. And for me, that's about, the idea that you would no longer procure, was it Apache that couldn't communicate with the RAF and things like this? Just complete madness. If you look at the Israelis, what's brilliant about the way they use all these effectors is it seems to be very heavily integrated data sharing, etc. So for our country, as you say, it's not necessarily tomorrow you'll be in a sort of, what would you call it? You'd call it a land contest that's very attrition. You used a good phrase earlier because you know what we're talking about. But the point is, you can see, stepping back, that where we've got to invest as a country, I think, is the data backbone, C2 space, as well as drones. Or we've got to work how you link it all together, because the key to it is autonomy, and that needs masses of data.
Do you mind if I just jump in on that? Because I think there's an interesting historical parallel here about both the advantages and disadvantages of integration of technology, and that goes back to the First World War and armour. And the dawning of armour in 1916 posed the Germans some significant challenges. And I think there's an interesting parallel to potentially some of the ongoing pitfalls we might see when we're thinking about how do we integrate these new uncrewed systems into the armed forces. Now, one of the most effective ways, if the most effective way of knocking out a tank in the First World War, was pointing a large caliber field gun at it and firing. And that meant that the Germans placed more of their artillery further forward to engage with the British use of armour, particularly after the first mass use in Cambrai in November 1917. But that, of course, came with a downside, which is the force composition placed more of German guns, which were still absolutely the real war winner at that point, exposed to British fire. And that changed, in an unforeseen way, the dynamics of their balance, of their force composition. So absolutely, it's not just about what the technology is capable of. It's about how do you place it into a system without potentially creating unexpected pitfalls. Now, thinking about the present day, one of the things that has sat with me through reading this paper is that question of countermeasures, which you rightly point out. Now, if we do have directed energy weapons, or even the low-tech solutions, nets, shotguns, well-trained falcons, whichever it may be, to knock these out, and they find a sustainable, cheap way of doing this, that is going to have a knock-on effect on both Ukraine's force composition, but on the potential for the British Army or the British services, or indeed wider NATO forces, that might beg immediate answers to the question. So that's where we're getting into questions like continued innovation. And there is the nature point that I made earlier, that when you get a technology very rapidly, in the grand scheme of history, I would say this, but relatively rapidly, you will see countermeasures beginning to be developed, because the same innovation cycles that produce the technology are also then engaged to produce the countermeasure. And so this creates that dynamic environment that both fascinates me as a historian of war, but also makes it very difficult for politicians and for soldiers alike.
And if I may say, and it does bring us into the ethical point, because By the way, we're meant to be taking questions.
No, we will be shortly, about 5 minutes, yeah.
I felt very sort of like we were monopolising. But on the ethical point, it really speaks to this because inevitably, because you get this constant countermeasures, the use, you know, how you've got fibre optic cables, you're constantly readjusting to what your adversary is doing. Ever more important will be your autonomy, the autonomy of the extent to which something can autonomously navigate, decide what it's going to do, defend itself, etc. Because that's one of the key ways you deal with things like being denied comms, right? But you've got something that's learning the landscape or whatever these other amazing technologies, which brings you to the ethics of it. And you know, my advice, and I had this wonderful select committee hearing as minister, and the Bishop of Coventry was asking me questions about the ethics of all this, and it was really interesting. And I just made the point: we're going to have to trust in our fundamental political nature. And what I mean by that is, to a certain extent, if we constrain ourselves, we'll just lose. Right? So I wouldn't impose any ethical restraint within reason. Because ultimately, if you like, we have fully autonomous, well, we have weapons which, once you commence their operation, can be effectively autonomous, like the Phalanx naval gun, right? Once you turn it on, if something comes in and fits certain parameters, it will fire autonomously. It's not fully autonomous because someone has to turn it on. And as long as that person is in a chain of command, which is ultimately democratic, you have faith that they're doing it in a way that's not going to be just indiscriminate, if you see what I mean. So that's the most important thing for me. But what we shouldn't do is then use it to impose levels. Because I must have, so I had this thing where there was a movement to try and get us to accept a definition of autonomy. You know, Mr. Cartledge, you know, Minister, got some legal advice here. We think recommendation to accept it, and I absolutely refused. Because if you tie your hands, you'll just end up losing the military conflict. In which case, democracy goes anyway. You know, so this doesn't mean anything goes, but I think personally, this is the area where several years from now, this is what will really determine success. When you talk about drones, you could be talking about incredibly capable fighters that are produced at relative mass that can do extraordinary things. And the thing that will determine that is their ability to fly themselves or respond. And we've got to dominate that. And to do that, we've got to be very aggressive, but nevertheless grounded in the fact that we'll always have a human in the loop somewhere, because that's what authorizes it. I mean, it's I think it's one of the most interesting debates there is. But that's how you solve your problem. You know, in the long run,
I'm less sanguine than you are about the ethics of these machines. But I think that the point that you make there about human in the loop is an interesting one. And I came from the AI point and the ethical point, actually from a slightly different perspective. And someone who's kind of in education, I've seen some of the immediate impacts of large language models, and AI is broadly, I think, a very misunderstood term, and I don't like in the ways that it's discussed, because it conjures up images of kind of Terminator and Skynet in a way that it really is not
a different
like
Skynet.
that. Yes, certainly. Sorry, not the military platform, but yes, certainly. But I came from this really from the psychological dimension and thinking about not necessarily a lack of faith in the difficulties, because I think consumers, we will come to reconcile this into our systems as we do with most technologies and figure that out. But the psychology of human in the loop systems, of watching people generally, if you have a system that is maybe 90+% reliable, we tend to come to rely on it. So we think that it is more infallible than maybe our own judgment. And that's the element that worries me, because a system that might be 90% reliable used 100 times is still wrong 10 times, or still gets you into trouble 10 of those times. So it needs to be extremely high reliability, or we need to get extremely well trained at making sure that the operators are.
Correct me if I'm wrong. So I think, is it Brimstone? But there will be others like this, but Brimstone is always used as an example. Once you fire it, it gets to a certain point where it can effectively choose its target. Is probably the wrong word, but it has a degree of autonomy in that sense.
I think it has a selected target set, and it can flick to whichever pre-programmed
something like,
target.
And it feels to me that, I mean, you know, so for uncrewed ground vehicles, right? they will have one very crude, and it's a horrible thing really, but big advantage. If they find a way through and eventually get to wherever they're meant to be, and all else fails, they can self-destruct. And things like this, why autonomy is important, but in navigation, especially in a completely denied environment, these things are going to be so important. And I think that essentially, what will become clear is that the phase we're going through is really, it's not really the uncrewed phase so much as the opposite. These things will be crewed, but they'll just be crewed by robots. It's driven by technology and autonomy, and we've got to master that. So I appreciate that. What no one will ever do is presumably produce something that is fully autonomous in a context where the ramifications are, detonation of something horrific. What we have got to do is develop these technologies in a way that gives us competitive advantage without such risk to ourselves. That's in our self-interest, and you'd assume it's in the self-interest of our adversaries, but they won't restrict themselves. So I think it's a really interesting area, but as I say, my position is we should maximize our pursuit of it and have faith in our underlying ethical, political construct, if you like.
I suppose I was more thinking not necessarily just about conventional operations, but more things like using AI for facial recognition of threats and opponents, and the way that certain technologies might be used in a more irregular conflict, that where mistakes might have quite profound ramifications, not just for the technology or the users of the technology or the nation, but where killing civilians might have a knock-on effect to the strategic rationale of the conflict, and that those are the sorts of questions that rather keep me up at night and make me think about the demands of this. That being said, I also want to say I don't think that invalidates the necessity to be looking at these platforms. They are just questions that we have to look very, very hard at and be brutally honest with ourselves. And as you say, it becomes a political question of confidence in the systems to be able to say, right, we believe that we will.
As has always been the case, from chemical weapons to nuclear, etc., you basically do have to have faith in the political institution, even a very dictatorial one, that in its own self-interest, it will police these things. I mean, this has been the case for decades, actually, if you think about it.
And there's a consequence. Deterrence, of course, will fall out of that and may reduce the likelihood of conflict, which is something really to be welcomed.
Okay, gentlemen, on that note, I'm going to open up to the floor for any questions that you might have. Have we had any online?
Yeah, I sent you one on WhatsApp, actually.
Okay. Sorry, mate, I was out of the league.
And the lady at the front with the bit.
Oh. Please, you go first, madam, please.
So, not really so much. There is a question at the end. I hope you're going to go for delay repay, yes?
Yeah, yes. They actually
but
flagged it up on the train, which
they do. No,
yeah.
that's nothing to do with this. But you're talking about like something made of wood, some little thing, and it knocks out a very sophisticated. It reminds me of a quote about Noah's Ark was built by amateurs, but Titanic. Because I checked whatever it was in his sank, but maybe I shouldn't be asking the question, but had Labour won the election in 2019 under Jeremy Corbyn, what might have happened? Because he weren't too hot on defence, was he?
I don't think this paper would have been written, I think, quite honestly.
Depends on the majority, to be honest, because he'd have had a lot of MPs on his own side who would not have permitted. I mean, but I've thought about that. What if you had a government that genuinely had odd views about, Russia? Oh, maybe we can have that in the future. Who knows? It worried a lot of us, but it worried the country, and that's why one of the reasons that fate didn't happen. In this country, I like to think that you have to be strong on national security, but it's interesting. I was in Germany recently, and their politicians were really worried about the prospect of certain party winning in this country, and the Le Pen party winning in France, for example. There are other countries now in Europe that have populist governments which are becoming a bit flaky on Ukraine, etc. I can't get over it. For me, I can't understand why anyone could confused about who the good guy is in that scenario. And there's obviously some reasons for it. But
Chapter 7, information maneuver,
exactly.
propaganda.
Correct. No. I don't think I think it is underrated the extent to which there are certain, it's a minority, but there are certain views in the UK that have taken hold that have clearly been influenced by bots and propaganda in a way that is terrifying in some respects, particularly around the vaccine and other aspects.
I actually think that it doesn't really matter. If Jeremy Corbyn will win, Ukraine will still fight. I mean, from that respect, in terms of that, you probably will have to write the paper about Ukrainian war. Because I do remember, like a lot of Western analysts were also given 72 hours to Ukrainian armed forces.
Mm.
You know, and
Boy, was that long.
we now almost 4 years. So obviously we overestimated the Russian army then, but I mean, we should not really underestimate it now. And Corbyn probably, that's overestimation. Ukraine is still, in relation to that war, his election or not election, I don't think it matters that much. Actually, the same relates to Marine Le Pen, to AfD or Wagenknecht, whatever her last name, from Der Linke in Germany. I mean, Ukraine is still fight. They got no choice. It's either erasure, it's a war. So
Yes, madam.
No, actually, we've started with Clausewitz. I wanted to take you to Sun Tzu and say there's a line between order and disorder lies in logistics. Probably could be rephrased now, the line between order and disorder lies in procurement. Treasury indeed has a cap on how much it can spend. So there is another source which is for private capital. And yet it's exceptionally hard to access, especially in the UK, because if you're a startup, if you're SME, and if you try to get private capital, you need those darn letters from the government specifying that you have contract and funding. Is that a pathway that the UK should really start considering in order to expedite its procurement cycle and to enliven its defense startup ecosystem? That's probably question number one, point number one. Point number two is pertaining to AI. We are all moving towards synthetic agents, whether it comes via LLMs, whether it comes by other forms of AI, it will come one way. Different centers of power have different approaches. So in the US has corporate approaches towards AI. In China, some may or may not know, every large language model has to adhere to socialist values. It's actually quite remarkable. One of the problems with Europe and the UK specifically is that AI is so tightly regulated lately, and that the AI developers have to jump through so many hoops and loops, they're simply living in droves. How can that be reconciled with the need, with autonomy and at least potential partial agency when executing military decisions in the battle?
Okay. Well, on the first point, it is a common question that SMEs, not succeeding. We talk about this thing called the valley of death. They come up with an idea, it gets some funding, maybe from something called DASA, but then it doesn't develop into a capability with the armed forces. In the occasions where it does, then it becomes successful. And I go back to the point I made before, that has happened with Kindred. So Kindred, which is the UK MOD budget for Ukraine, has funded SMEs and to develop stuff for Ukraine. We've not done enough taking that into our own armed forces. I mean, the classic case, you're talking about electronic countermeasures. I was visiting the Army and the Royal Engineers in Essex recently, and they still have a yellow box that goes in the vehicle that was in Afghanistan. Well, a British company has made a very good version of that. It's out in Ukraine and doing very well. We don't have it in our own army. It's a bit crazy. I think on that, one of the most important things, something I wanted to really try and encourage, was far greater data sharing between main building in MOD and defence companies who would have cleared people, security cleared, who would come in at secret to have constant updates on what is going on, so that because data and battlefield knowledge is so important, which is why linking with Ukrainian companies is another good way to facilitate that. On the second point of, I find it a little bit frustrating that, we sort of suddenly it's Anduril and other big American companies going to do our big AI contracts in the UK. We don't seem to have a champion nationally, which gives us full IP, and yet we do have very good digital sector in this country. So I'm slightly surprised at that. And I think that, again, it goes back to my first point, the stronger relationship between dual use companies, not just defence, and MOD sharing information. But, if you've got a presidential visit, some of those US companies are going to be well placed. Sorry.
Yeah, I think we've got time for one more question. Actually, I know you're noting something down.
I did, but we're probably straying on a line there that we'll stay away from.
Yes, sir.
In terms of cheap, game-changing technology, how is it differentiated what you need for, say, drones between dense urban warfare and large planes? Was that basically a software change for the different environments? And the second question is, how does procurement change, if at all, if you're fighting a conscript First World Army versus either religious fanatics like ISIS or clan-based troops like in Afghanistan?
I think it depends what you're asking the drones to do. I think if we focus on the environment over the task, we've probably put the cart before the horse slightly. And if we break combat down into 4 functions, find, fix, strike, and exploit, those are the sort of the ways you would try and put a mission together. If you're using a drone in the find capability for an ISTAR purpose, it's going to depend on the range that the drone needs to operate at, what it's actually looking for, in terms of whether the target's hidden or whether it's tank battalions going across an open plain, or whether it's a bunch of fighters holed up in a building or in a tunnel or wherever it might be. So it's really what you're asking the drone to do is what's going to shape its form rather than the environment it's operating in. Although of course the environment will play a degree of a factor. Particularly if you're talking about line of sight, or such as Ukraine, where you're using fiber optic cable to try and get around jamming systems, for example. Does anyone else want to take the second off?
I can dive in on both of those actually, because I think I think that's a superb question, and the terrain point is one that is certainly I've certainly been kicking around both in my delivery to professional soldiers and to the cadets as well. And urban warfare, of course, is very significant in what it does. I want to take it back to a kind of sweeping academic and military concept that really bubbled out of the late 1980s and early 1990s, a thing called the RMA, or the Revolution in Military Affairs. And this came out of those rapid developments in information technology systems. And the conventional wisdom for much of the 90s was that these were going to render the fog of war in the battle space completely absent. And if you could locate the enemy, you could target the enemy, you could destroy the enemy. Now, of course, what came along was the war on terror, Iraq and Afghanistan. And all of a sudden, those sensor technologies looked much more limited in their application, both because of the battle spaces that were being fought in, but also the nature of the opponent. And so this speaks to your second question, which is, yes, we have these great advancements in technology. The truth is, we're yet to see just how successful it's going to be in determining whether that thermal signature is a civilian or whether it's an insurgent. Or on an open field, that becomes an easier question against your regular conscripts. Just as the RMA proved to be flawed, we might have to recognise that some of these technologies have limitations. That being said, it is, as Andrew's report makes clear, a process that is moving forward. So what comes in the future remains to be seen. But I think this also speaks to the importance of the human in the loop, of having someone who can maybe identify some of the patterns or behaviours or the signatures that either denotes that separate civilian from combatant in the best way they possibly can. But I think it's going to be really difficult. And don't underestimate irregular opponents' ingenuity in finding ways of circumventing technological systems, quite often with really rudimentary technologies of their own, like digging a big tunnel.
In the second example, in the second question, the special forces become quite important. And one thing it's probably sensible not to do is to reopen legacy investigations into what your special forces did 30 years ago, sending a message to anyone. Why on earth would you ever serve your country? Because you're getting put on trial for what you did serving your nation. I mean, quite extraordinary what is happening. But I think that, you know, absolutely right. There is a risk in assuming sort of technology here today is sort of indomitable. Drones are indomitable, etc. That for me, the lesson is the way in which it's constantly evolving. So what you've got to get is this relationship, this constant engagement between your industry and your defence users, the army, said, in a way that perhaps we hadn't before, and to a degree. But I think it's really positive, and it could suit us as a country if we allow that to happen and don't. And because at the moment I think defence in the UK is struggling between business as usual, the old system, the big primes, all the rest of it, although we'll always need them, and this new, much more flexible, SME-dominated way. And I think both are possible, but at the moment, you know, it's not. We haven't really made the switch in reality.
Okay, so I hope today we've suitably covered the political to the operational and then more to the tactical. I hope you enjoy the paper. And I think a lot of the subjects we've actually touched on today is covered in my next paper, which is lessons that we can learn from the IDF's performance in Gaza, which I'm busy rewriting from present into past tense, whilst keeping a reversionary copy of the present tense. But thank you for coming. Hope you enjoyed it. Much appreciated.